Section 1. The calm before the chaos. It was a blazing summer afternoon, the kind of day that begged for laughter, sun-soaked skin, and the splashes of a carefree pool party echoing across the backyard. Friends had gathered with towels, floaties, and ice-cold drinks, the music pulsing lightly in the background and the scent of sunscreen and barbecue mingling with the warm air. I had been planning this gathering for weeks, carefully coordinating with neighbors, and making sure the event stayed within all HOA guidelines, except, of course, for one persistent thorn in the community's side. Karen. She had a history of inserting herself into every neighborhood activity with unsolicited criticism, petty demands, and threats designed to intimidate anyone who dared enjoy life in a way she disapproved of. At first, the party seemed blissfully ordinary, laughter filling the air as kids cannonballed into the pool and friends shared jokes under colorful umbrellas. But I noticed her long, deliberate gaze from across the street, a familiar sight that always preceded confrontation. Karen was striding toward the property with that signature determination, clipboard in hand, her expression a volatile mix of fury, self-righteousness, and vindictive intent. My heart sank, recognizing the familiar pattern. She had somehow learned about the party in advance and had decided to intervene, confident that she could assert her imagined authority over private events and public enjoyment. Before I could even step forward to greet her, she was shouting across the yard, accusing me of violating HOA rules, and insisting that the party must cease immediately. Her tone was theatrical, meant to alarm neighbors, frighten attendees, and assert dominance, but it only had the opposite effect on the crowd, who paused to watch the spectacle unfold. Karen claimed that the noise, the gathering, and even the laughter itself were breaches of community regulations, and she waved her clipboard as if it were a legal warrant rather than a sheet of HOA guidelines. Guests began exchanging nervous glances, unsure whether to intervene, stay silent, or leave, and a wave of tension rippled through the once carefree atmosphere. I attempted to reason with her calmly, explaining that the party was within legal and HOA limits, that all safety measures were in place, and that her interference was not legally enforceable. But Karen ignored logic entirely, escalating her volume and gestures, insisting that she had the authority to shut this down and implying that failure to comply would result in fines or complaints filed to higher authorities. The familiar fear crept in, the same anxiety that had accompanied past encounters with her escalating antics, but this time I was prepared. I discreetly called the local police department, explaining the situation and the likelihood of harassment escalating if Karen was left unchecked. Within minutes, the distant wail of a siren signaled the arrival of help, a visible shift in the dynamic as Karen's confident swagger faltered slightly, the certainty in her eyes giving way to irritation and disbelief. The police officer, arriving calmly but decisively, positioned himself between Karen and the pool party, assessing the situation with the measured authority that had thwarted her antics before. "Ma'am," he instructed, voice firm yet neutral, "please step back. This is a private property, and your claims of authority do not grant you permission to harass the residents or interfere with lawful activity." Karen's face twitched with a combination of anger and disbelief. For the first time, her usual tactics, the shouting, the gesturing, the waving of papers, were met with clear, undeniable authority, and the crowd could sense the shift in control. She sputtered objections, referencing her HOA position, demanding to know why the police had been called, and asserting that the party was somehow a violation of community standards, but the officer remained unwavering, emphasizing that private gatherings within legal limits were not subject to her unilateral control. The tension, thick and palpable, began to dissipate as neighbors and guests realized that Karen's influence had no weight in this scenario. Her dramatic entrance, designed to intimidate, had been neutralized by law enforcement. Karen, still visibly fuming, eventually retreated slightly, muttering about injustice and unchecked residents, but her authority had been decisively undercut, leaving her in a state of semi-controlled panic. The party resumed, laughter slowly returning, music gently pulsing again, and the initial dread replaced by relief and a renewed sense of safety, as everyone recognized that law, reason, and community support had effectively protected the event from Karen's obsessive attempts to dominate and control. It was a vivid reminder that people like Karen thrive on intimidation and the illusion of power, but that authority and preparedness could neutralize even the most dramatic interventions, allowing life and summer fun to proceed uninterrupted. Section 2. Karen escalates her interference. After her initial thwarted attempt at shutting down the pool party, Karen refused to back down, as if the very idea of someone enjoying a private gathering without her approval was an existential threat she couldn't tolerate. She immediately began orchestrating a more elaborate campaign to assert her dominance, targeting not just me, but anyone in the neighborhood she believed would support or attend the event. Within hours, she began sending furious emails and messages to the HOA board, claiming that I had violated multiple community rules, that the noise and reckless behavior were illegal, and that she had been forced to intervene to protect the sanctity of the neighborhood. Her communications were long, angry, and filled with bolded claims and caps lock threats, suggesting fines, complaints, and even litigation, all meant to create the impression of authority and urgency. At the same time, she began visiting neighbors who had previously attended my parties or engaged with me socially, attempting to intimidate them into denouncing the gathering. She lingered on front lawns, peered into windows, and repeatedly made veiled threats about consequences if anyone continued to support lawlessness in the neighborhood. Her behavior created a palpable tension among residents, with some worried about potential confrontation, others frustrated by her obsessive interference, and a few recognizing that this was yet another pattern in her escalating cycle of harassment. Meanwhile, I meticulously documented every interaction, recording emails, messages, and videos, knowing that evidence was essential to protect myself and others from her increasingly erratic attempts at control. The police were notified again, and an officer arrived at the neighborhood to assess the situation, ensuring that Karen's continued presence did not escalate into harassment or intimidation. When she noticed law enforcement, Karen's confidence wavered slightly, though she attempted to maintain a facade of authority, loudly insisting that the HOA rules granted her full rights to police private gatherings and asserting that the party constituted a neighborhood emergency requiring her intervention. The officer, patient yet firm, explained that HOA guidelines could not be enforced in this manner, particularly when the gathering was legal, safe, and contained entirely within private property. He reiterated that any future threats or attempts to obstruct lawful activity would result in citations or criminal charges, creating a clear boundary that Karen could not cross without consequence. Despite this, her behavior became increasingly erratic. She attempted to live stream her confrontation, pointing her phone toward the officer and the crowd, shouting that she was being silenced and ignored by corrupt authorities. Neighbors, many of whom were initially intimidated by her past antics, watched with a mix of astonishment and relief as her once intimidating persona crumbled under the calm authority of law enforcement and the visible documentation of her harassment. Karen's attempts to rally others in the neighborhood failed as well. Her history of obsessive control had alienated residents, and attempts to draw support for her claims were met with skepticism or outright rejection. Her credibility, once a source of fear, had eroded completely, leaving her as a solitary figure of escalating desperation. Meanwhile, the party itself continued under the watchful eye of the officer, who remained on site to ensure that no further confrontations occurred. Guests resumed their activities with cautious optimism, realizing that Karen's presence, while disruptive, could not override legal protections, community support, or the authority of the police. Over the next few hours, Karen attempted several more interventions, approaching with increasingly dramatic gestures, shouting accusations, and attempting to intimidate the crowd. But each effort was met with immediate, firm intervention by law enforcement. With each thwarted attempt, her frustration mounted, her gestures became wilder, and her shouts more incoherent, painting a vivid picture of someone desperate to reclaim imagined authority but unable to do so under scrutiny. By the evening, It was clear that Karen's campaign had not only failed but had exposed her obsession and irrationality to the entire neighborhood. Her threats, once intimidating, now served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that persistent, obsessive attempts to dominate others could be neutralized with preparedness, documentation, and reliance on proper authority. The combination of legal knowledge, police presence, and neighbor vigilance had effectively dismantled her influence, creating an environment where residents could reclaim their sense of security and enjoy their private activities without fear. Karen's repeated failures fueled her obsession even further, but the visible, calm authority of the police and the collective awareness of the community had created a barrier she could not breach, leaving her increasingly isolated, frustrated, and powerless. What had begun as a seemingly innocuous pool party had evolved into a high-stakes confrontation between obsessive control and lawful enjoyment, demonstrating that intimidation and threats could be effectively countered when evidence, authority, and community unity were properly aligned. By the end of this escalation, it was clear that Karen, despite her continued agitation, had no legal or social ground to stand on, and the stage was set for the eventual resolution where her actions would face full accountability, and the community could fully reclaim both peace and enjoyment of their private spaces. Section 3. The height of Karen's obsession as the pool party entered its peak, laughter and splashes echoing across the backyard. Karen's obsession with control reached a fever pitch, transforming her presence from irritating interference into an almost cinematic confrontation. She arrived once again, her posture rigid, face flushed with anger, and eyes darting wildly, scanning the crowd for perceived allies and enemies alike. This time, she was armed not only with her ever-present clipboard, but with an array of papers, letters, and printed screenshots, each allegedly proving her authority to shut down the event. As soon as she appeared, she launched into a dramatic speech, shouting that the gathering violated HOA rules, that she had the right to enforce fines, and that the law itself was turning a blind eye to community chaos. Her voice carried across the yard, drawing the attention of neighbors who had not been present before, some of whom cautiously approached to witness the escalating spectacle. I immediately called the police for support, anticipating that her behavior could spiral into harassment or even physical intimidation. Within minutes, officers arrived, stepping decisively between Karen and the party, their calm yet commanding presence cutting through the tension like a blade. Karen, however, was undeterred. She waved papers in the air, attempted to live stream her tirade, and shouted that the officers were ignoring the truth and siding with the lawless. Neighbors watched in disbelief, some capturing video footage as evidence, others shaking their heads at the extreme contrast between her theatrics and the calm authority of the responding officers. As Karen continued her tirade, it became increasingly clear that she was no longer attempting reason or negotiation. Her entire focus was now on creating chaos, intimidating attendees, and asserting control through sheer volume and aggression. Her gestures became erratic, pointing at individuals, pacing frantically, and issuing loud, personal threats that were caught on multiple cameras. The officers, seasoned and composed, began documenting her behavior, while calmly explaining her lack of authority over private property and reiterating that her threats could result in immediate legal consequences. Her face twisted with disbelief and fury as she realized that her usual tactics, intimidation, theatrics, and appeals to authority, were ineffective in the face of law enforcement and community solidarity. Every shout, every wild gesture, and every attempt at dominance only added to the evidence against her, reinforcing that her behavior was harassment and not legitimate enforcement. Despite repeated warnings, she attempted to move closer to the pool, gesturing wildly at guests, some of whom began retreating towards safer areas, while others remained, bolstered by the visible police presence. Her fury was palpable, her attempts to provoke a reaction more desperate with each passing moment. The police, maintaining a calm barrier, informed her that any further attempts to intimidate, block access, or interfere with the gathering would result in citations or immediate arrest. The sheer public visibility of the event amplified her embarrassment and frustration. Cameras, neighbors, and officers bore witness to every irrational claim and aggressive gesture she made. As the confrontation dragged on, It became apparent that Karen's obsession was now self-destructive. Her attempts to assert control were futile, her authority non-existent, and her escalating antics only ensured that law enforcement would remain on site until the situation was fully under control. Gradually, the officers guided her away from the immediate area, documenting her behavior for potential legal action. While neighbors began returning to the party, laughter slowly resuming as the palpable tension eased. Karen, however, continued muttering, gesturing, and attempting to assert authority even as she was led to a safe distance, a vivid image of obsession colliding with law and reason. The crowd, once intimidated by her reputation, now watched in astonishment as the woman who had so often disrupted community events became a spectacle of her own unraveling, powerless against evidence, authority, and collective vigilance. The pool party, which had begun with simple enjoyment and leisure, had been transformed into a dramatic standoff, illustrating both the dangers of unchecked obsession and the protective power of law, documentation, and community unity. By the end of the confrontation, Karen's failure was undeniable. Her threats had been neutralized, her attempts to assert authority completely ineffective, and her credibility further eroded among neighbors who had witnessed her erratic behavior firsthand. The officers remained present until they were confident that she could not interfere further, ensuring that the gathering could continue safely. What had been intended as a private celebration became a clear demonstration of how obsession, intimidation, and the illusion of power crumble when confronted with preparedness, law enforcement, and collective resolve. Karen, though still muttering and gesturing from a distance, had no remaining influence over the event or the neighborhood. Her obsession had reached its peak, and the consequences of her unchecked aggression were fully visible to all who had witnessed the spectacle. By the time the sun began to set, the backyard was once again filled with laughter, music, and relief, the officer's presence having secured the space and reaffirmed the boundary that Karen could not cross. The dramatic climax of the day not only neutralized her threat, but also empowered the community, creating a tangible sense of victory over intimidation and obsession, and setting the stage for the final resolution, where Karen's actions would face full accountability, legal consequences, and public exposure. Section 4. Karen's final meltdown as the sun reached its zenith and the pool party continued with laughter and music. Karen, unrelenting and increasingly unhinged, returned for one last dramatic attempt to assert control over the gathering. She appeared at the edge of the property with a mix of fury and desperation etched across her face, waving her clipboard and papers like a flag of authority, shouting accusations that the party was illegal, unsafe, and a violation of HOA ethics. Her voice carried across the yard, drawing the attention of neighbors, passers-by, and even city officials who happened to be nearby, creating a tense spectacle that instantly shifted the mood of the afternoon. Guests paused mid-laugh, some frozen with apprehension, while others instinctively moved closer to the officers already present to ensure their protection. Karen's energy was almost theatrical in its intensity. She pointed fingers, gestured wildly, and attempted to record herself as a martyr of supposed injustice, live streaming every claim that she had been wronged by lawless neighbors who refused to obey her. However, the police remained calm, positioning themselves firmly between her and the party, making it abundantly clear that her presence did not grant her any legal authority over private property or lawful gatherings. Her usual arsenal of intimidation tactics, shouting, dramatic gestures, and appeals to HOA power were ineffective, and the crowd could visibly sense the shift. Karen, once a feared figure in the neighborhood, now appeared isolated, flustered, and increasingly desperate. She demanded that the party cease immediately, claiming that every splash, laugh, and conversation was a punishable offense. Yet every claim was met with measured responses from law enforcement explaining her limits and the legality of the private event. Her frustration escalated, her words becoming more fragmented and incoherent, as the officers calmly documented every threat and every outburst. Neighbors who had initially been intimidated now openly observed, some recording her antics on their phones, creating an unintentional but damning record of her irrational behavior. Karen's dramatic posturing reached its peak when she attempted to storm closer to the pool, gesturing aggressively toward the attendees. An officer intervened, gently but firmly guiding her back, while clearly explaining that further intrusion or threats could result in citations, restraining orders, or arrest. Her face twisted with disbelief and rage. The very authority she believed she possessed had been stripped from her in front of the entire community. Attempts to call HOA allies for support were futile. Her reputation had crumbled due to previous confrontations, and neighbors openly criticized her obsessive behavior. Even her live streams, meant to garner sympathy and rally outsiders, only served to highlight her erratic actions, broadcasting her public humiliation far beyond the neighborhood. Karen's fury now bordered on hysteria. She shouted, gestured wildly, and attempted multiple times to assert control, yet each intervention by law enforcement neutralized her attempts. The dramatic contrast between her chaotic behavior and the officer's calm authority only emphasized her loss of control. Guests, once tense and wary, slowly resumed their enjoyment, buoyed by the visible presence of police and the realization that Karen's power over the gathering had been entirely nullified. The scene had transformed into a spectacle of obsession versus authority, a vivid demonstration that intimidation and manipulation cannot withstand preparation, legal awareness, and collective vigilance. After repeated warnings and documentation, Karen was finally escorted to a safe distance, still muttering about injustice, but effectively removed from the immediate area, her ability to disrupt the party fully neutralized. The backyard, once fraught with tension, returned to laughter, music, and playful splashing. The event continued uninterrupted, a testament to law enforcement's effectiveness and the resilience of the community. Witnesses, neighbors, and attendees shared videos and accounts, ensuring that Karen's repeated harassment was publicly documented, creating a permanent record of her obsessive attempts to control events that were legally and socially outside her jurisdiction. By the time the day ended, the party had not only survived but emerged as a symbol of triumph over intimidation and obsession. Karen's meltdown had exposed her irrationality, her lack of authority, and her inability to influence events when faced with proper legal and communal checks. Her dramatic gestures, shouting, and attempts at control had backfired spectacularly, leaving her isolated, publicly humiliated, and powerless. The park and private property had been defended, the guests' safety ensured, and the neighborhood had collectively witnessed the consequences of unchecked obsession. Karen's meltdown, while extreme, served as a stark lesson. Intimidation, ego, and obsessive control can be countered through preparation, documentation, law enforcement presence, and the support of the community. The sun set over the pool as families and friends celebrated not only the joy of the party, but the ultimate triumph of reason and law over chaos and intimidation. The drama had reached its peak, the conflict fully exposed, and the stage was set for the final section, which would detail the long-term resolution, Karen's consequences, and the enduring sense of safety and empowerment that the neighborhood reclaimed. Section 5, Karen's consequences and community triumph in the days following the chaotic confrontation at the pool party. Karen's relentless attempts to assert control unraveled completely, leaving her exposed, isolated, and fully accountable for her harassment. The police, having meticulously documented every outburst, threat, and interference, issued formal citations for repeated harassment, intimidation, and unlawful attempts to disrupt a private gathering. The HOA, which had previously allowed her to wield influence over community decisions, distanced itself entirely from her, emphasizing that her actions were extreme, obsessive, and legally indefensible. Her social media campaigns, meant to garner sympathy or rally support, backfired spectacularly. Videos of her screaming, gesturing wildly, and attempting to block lawful activities went viral within the neighborhood, amplifying her public humiliation and cementing her reputation as an overzealous, irrational figure whose obsession with control had blinded her to reason and law. Legal repercussions began to mount. Fines from citations, potential civil liability for the distress she caused to neighbors and party attendees, and mounting legal fees for defending her own claims all created tangible consequences that she could not evade. Attempts to appeal to HOA allies failed, as those who had once tolerated her manipulations recognized that her behavior endangered not only the community's peace, but also her own credibility. Residents who had witnessed her outbursts, previously intimidated by her reputation, now felt empowered and supported, their unity reinforcing the protective boundaries of a neighborhood. The private pool party, once threatened by her obsessive interference, became a symbol of resilience, demonstrating that preparation, documentation, and reliance on law enforcement could effectively counter even the most determined attempts at intimidation. Karen's continued attempts to regain influence were futile. Any attempt to approach the property or engage with residents was met with firm police warnings, restraining orders where necessary, and community documentation. Her obsession, which had once projected fear, now became a source of public ridicule, her authority over the HOA and neighbors rendered entirely meaningless. Over time, the neighborhood regained a sense of safety and normalcy, the air of tension that had hung over the community dissipating as residents returned to their routines, secure in the knowledge that their legal rights and private spaces were protected. The pool party itself, which had survived the dramatic confrontation, continued as an annual event, a celebration of joy, community resilience, and the triumph of preparation over intimidation. Karen's saga served as a cautionary tale. Unchecked obsession, ego, and attempts to dominate others cannot succeed when evidence, authority, and collective vigilance are properly aligned. Her repeated failures, escalating outbursts, and ultimate public humiliation demonstrated that law and community oversight are powerful tools against harassment, and that those who attempt to wield fear as a weapon ultimately undermine themselves. For me and the other residents, the experience underscored the importance of vigilance, meticulous documentation, and the calm intervention of law enforcement when facing threats, showing that preparedness can transform fear into empowerment. By the time weeks had passed, Karen had become a figure of caution, her credibility in ruins, her attempts at intimidation nullified, and her obsessive need for control firmly checked. The neighborhood had not only survived her interference, but emerged stronger, united, and confident in its collective ability to protect private spaces and community peace. Laughter returned to the backyard. Music once again filled the air, and residents celebrated not only the joy of gatherings, but also the knowledge that reason, law, and unity had prevailed. Karen, despite her persistence, had no remaining power to disrupt events, influence neighbors, or assert control over private activities. The combination of public accountability, law enforcement oversight, and community solidarity ensured that her obsession had no lasting impact, leaving the neighborhood safer, empowered, and free to enjoy their lives without fear. The pool party had become more than a celebration. It was a testament to the enduring strength of preparation, legal knowledge, and communal support in the face of harassment and intimidation. As the sun set on that summer, the neighborhood collectively exhaled, the echoes of splashing water and laughter signaling both victory over Karen's obsessive interference and the reaffirmation of the principle that no one, no matter how determined or obsessive, can act above the law or undermine the safety and enjoyment of a community without facing consequences. Karen's story, once one of intimidation and drama, concluded as a cautionary tale, a vivid illustration that obsession collapses under the weight of law, authority, and collective vigilance, while the neighborhood emerged resilient, united, and empowered, ready to reclaim both its peace and its joy in every future celebration.